Officer Grant Miller thought he was hunting a trespasser in the most exclusive zip code in the country. He didn't realize he was actually the one walking into a cage. 9:47 a.m., the countdown to a career's execution has already begun. The morning air in Oak Ridge Heights didn't just smell like freshly cut grass and expensive espresso. It smelled like untouchable security. This was a neighborhood where the gates didn't just keep people out, they kept a certain way of life in. Officer Grant Miller loved this neighborhood. To him, the uniform he wore was the only thing that gave him more authority than the millionaires who lived here. Miller's patrol car slowed as he turned onto Heritage Drive. His eyes, narrowed and perpetually searching for a reason to exert power, locked onto a figure standing in the driveway of a sprawling, $3 million colonial estate. The man was black. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Miller's patrol car. He was leaning against a sleek, midnight blue BMW, checking a silver Omega Seamaster on his wrist. To anyone else, it was a picture of success. To Grant Miller, it was a suspicious activity report waiting to happen. Miller didn't call it in. He didn't wait for backup. He wanted this one for himself. He pulled the cruiser to a sharp, aggressive stop, the tires screeching just enough to announce his arrival. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the pristine pavement, a sound that usually made people nervous. But the man by the car didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. "What do you think you're doing here, boy?" Miller's voice cut through the suburban silence like a serrated blade. The man, Elias Sterling, slowly looked up. His face was a mask of calm, too calm. "Officer, I suggest you lower your tone," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. Miller's face twisted. He hated that tone. It was the tone of someone who wasn't afraid. He lunged forward, grabbing Sterling's wrist and twisting it upward to get a look at the watch. "Is this Rolex stolen? Did you break into this house, or are you just scouting for your friends?" Before Sterling could answer, Miller shoved him backward, slamming him against the hood of the BMW. The metallic thud echoed off the neighboring houses like a gunshot. "Hands behind your back. Now." "I live here," Sterling said. His voice remained steady, though his eyes held a cold, predatory light. Miller let out a jagged, cruel laugh. "Sure you do, and I'm the King of England." He pressed his forearm into Sterling's neck, the smell of stale coffee and unearned confidence radiating off him. What Miller didn't see was the small, silver eagle pin on Sterling's lapel, the mark of 23 years of federal service. He didn't see the way Sterling's thumb was hovering over a small, encrypted button on his watch. Across the street, a curtain fluttered. Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood's unofficial record keeper, had already started her live stream. The viewer count was currently at 12. By the time this hour was over, it would be in the millions. Miller reached into Sterling's pocket and snatched his wallet, flipping it open with the contempt of a man who believed he was above the law. He pulled out a Federal Credit Union Platinum card, squinting at it in the morning sun. "Elias Sterling," Miller read with a sneer. "Where'd you steal a government-issued card, Elias? You a high-level scammer now." Sterling didn't blink. "That card is authentic, Officer Miller, just like the badge you're currently tarnishing." Miller stiffened. He didn't like being talked to by a suspect who knew his name. He checked his own watch. 9:50 a.m. "You've got 10 minutes to tell me the truth before I take you downtown, and let the boys in processing have some fun with you," Miller hissed. Sterling leaned his head back against the cold metal of his car. He looked up at the blue sky, a faint, chilling smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "In 10 minutes, Officer Miller," Sterling whispered. "I won't be the one going anywhere. But you'll be wishing you'd stayed in bed this morning." The radio on Miller's shoulder crackled. It was his partner, Officer Sarah Vance, asking for his location. Miller ignored it. He was too deep in his own power trip to realize that the prey he had pinned against the car was actually the man who had been sent to dismantle his entire department. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the clock was ticking. Officer Miller thought he was performing for the neighborhood, showing them he could clean up their streets. He didn't realize 15,000 people were already voting on his career's execution. 9:52 a.m. The audience is seated, and the protagonist is just getting started. The silence of the suburbs was a lie. Behind the manicured hedges and triple-pane windows of Oak Ridge Heights, eyes were everywhere. Officer Grant Miller stood over Elias Sterling, his hand resting heavily on his service weapon, savoring the feeling of being the center of attention. He believed he was the hero of this story, the thin blue line protecting the elite from an intruder. Across the street, Mrs. Gable held her phone with trembling hands, the lens focused squarely on Miller's badge. Her live stream was catching fire. The comments were a blur of digital fury, calls for justice clashing with the dark, anonymous voices of those who assumed Sterling was guilty simply because of the color of his suit and the color of his skin. "You see that, Elias?" Miller sneered, gesturing vaguely at the houses. "The community is watching. They want you gone. They pay for security to keep people like you from casing the joint." Sterling didn't look at the houses. He looked at Miller. His gaze was analytical, like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. "The community is indeed watching, officer," Sterling replied, his voice a calm contrast to Miller's mounting aggression. "But I think you're misinterpreting their interest. They aren't watching me. They're watching the end of your career." Miller's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He stepped closer, invading Sterling's personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You've got a lot of mouth for a guy in handcuffs," Miller hissed. "I'm not in handcuffs yet, Miller," Sterling noted. "But the clock is at 9:53, 7 minutes. I'd use them wisely if I were you." A second cruiser pulled up, tires crunching on the gravel. Officer Sarah Vance stepped out, her expression a mixture of professional skepticism and immediate bias. She looked at the $3 million Colonial, then at Sterling's BMW, and finally at Sterling himself. "What have we got, Miller?" Vance asked, her hand instinctively hovering near her belt. "Trespasser, claims he lives here. Found him fiddling with the car," Miller lied, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "I didn't claim it," Sterling corrected calmly. "I stated it. My keys are in my right jacket pocket. They open the front door, the mailbox, and the vehicle you're currently leaning on." Vance reached in and pulled out the key ring. She held them up, the BMW fob glinting in the morning sun. "Could be stolen, could be copies," she muttered, mirroring Miller's refusal to see the truth. At that moment, the neighborhood's enforcer appeared. Lydia Vance, no relation to the officer, the HOA coordinator, marched down the sidewalk wearing her official badge pinned to a designer jogging suit. She had been the only person who refused to wave to Sterling when he moved in 2 years ago. "Officers," Lydia said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "We've had several reports of suspicious individuals lately. Better safe than sorry, right?" "Exactly," Miller beamed, feeling validated. "Ma'am, do you recognize this man?" Lydia looked Sterling up and down with a cold, dismissive sneer. "He doesn't belong here. This neighborhood has standards, and he clearly doesn't fit the profile." Sterling's phone buzzed in Miller's hand. The screen lit up. "Director Jensen, FBI." Miller looked at the screen and laughed. "Check this out, Vance. Director Jensen. This guy got his drug dealer saved as the FBI director. Real creative, Elias." He swiped to answer, putting it on speaker for the growing crowd to hear. Yeah, this is Officer Miller. Your boy Elias is currently being detained for trespassing. You want to post bail, or should I just toss the phone in the evidence locker? The voice that came back was not a drug dealer's. It was a voice made of iron and ice. Officer Miller, I am Director Jensen of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are currently interfering with a federal officer. Put Agent Sterling on the phone immediately. Miller's grin didn't falter, but his eyes twitched. And I'm the President of the United States. Nice try, Director. See you at the station. He killed the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. Miller, maybe we should check the ID again, Vance whispered, her confidence finally beginning to leak. No, Miller snapped, his ego now fully driving the vehicle. He's a liar. They're all liars. He's going downtown. Sterling looked at his watch. 9:56 a.m., the small encrypted display on his Omega blinked. Squadrons deployed. ETA 4 minutes. Officer Miller, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. I'm going to give you one last chance to de-escalate. Take your hand off your weapon, return my property, and walk away. If you don't, the next 4 minutes will be the last 4 minutes of your career. The neighbors gasped. The livestream viewer count hit 25,000. Miller pulled his handcuffs from his belt, the metallic ratcheting sound echoing like a death knell. Threatening an officer, that's another charge, boy. He grabbed Sterling's arms, wrenching them behind his back with unnecessary force. The steel bit into Sterling's wrists. Badge number 4471, Sterling said quietly as the cuffs clicked shut. Grant Miller, I told you to remember it, because by noon it's going to be a museum exhibit for how not to do your job. Miller slammed Sterling against the patrol car, his face inches from Sterling's. You're done, Sterling. You're absolutely done. But as Miller looked up, he saw something in the distance that made his heart skip a beat. 3 heavy, black SUVs with tinted windows and government plates were rounding the corner of Heritage Drive, moving with the silent, predatory speed of a shark in shallow water. Sterling smiled against the cold metal of the cruiser. 9:59, Miller, time's up. The SUVs didn't just stop, they surrounded. And when Director Sarah Jensen stepped out, the air didn't just get cold, it froze. 10:00 a.m., the trap has snapped shut, and the predator is now the prey. The black SUVs moved with a coordinated, lethal precision that made the local patrol cars look like toys. They didn't park. They formed a perimeter, sealing off the end of Heritage Drive. The doors opened in unison, and 6 agents in dark suits and earpieces stepped out, their expressions carved from granite. Officer Grant Miller felt his throat go dry. His hand, still holding Elias Sterling's wrist against the cruiser, began to tremble slightly. He looked at the tinted glass of the lead vehicle, waiting for the monster inside to reveal itself. From the backseat, a woman emerged. Director Sarah Jensen was a legend in the Bureau, a woman who had dismantled cartels and corrupted senatorial offices with the same effortless poise she used to straighten her immaculate suit jacket. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the houses. She looked directly at Miller, and her gaze was a blade. Officer Miller, she said, her voice carrying a crisp, terrifying authority that silenced every bird in the trees. I believe we were just cut off on the phone. Miller's voice came out as a pathetic croak. You're really the FBI. Jensen didn't answer. She produced her credentials, the gold and blue of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, catching the morning light with blinding intensity. I am Director Jensen, and you are currently in possession of my Assistant Director of the Civil Rights Division. The words hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. The neighbors, who had been murmuring in support of the police, suddenly went silent. Mrs. Gable's livestream viewer count leaped to 45,000 as the reality of the situation set in. "Assistant Director?" Miller stammered, his eyes darting to the man he had just slammed against the car. But he was suspicious. He didn't have documentation. He said he lived here. "He didn't have documentation because you didn't ask for it," Jensen interrupted, her voice gaining a dangerous edge. "You saw a black man in a high-end neighborhood and you made a choice. You chose bias over procedure. You chose ego over the law." Officer Sarah Vance stepped back, her face pale, desperately trying to put distance between herself and Miller. Even Lydia Vance, the HOA coordinator, began to retreat toward her house, her official badge suddenly feeling like a target. "Agent Sterling," Jensen said, nodding toward Elias. "Status report." Sterling finally turned around, the handcuffs forcing a stiff, awkward movement of his shoulders. Despite the steel biting into his skin and his suit being wrinkled against the cruiser, he looked like the most powerful man on the street. "Currently detained on suspicion of existing while successful, Director," Sterling said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Officer Miller has ignored my credentials, confiscated my property, and threatened me with further physical force." Jensen's eyes moved back to Miller. "Badge number 4471, she whispered, echoing Sterling's earlier warning. "I have your file right here, officer. 17 complaints in 24 months, 89% of them involving people of color. Would you like me to read the details of the excessive force allegation from last April?" Miller's knees felt weak. He realized then that this wasn't just a random stop gone wrong. This was a reckoning. "This is Operation Mirror," Jensen announced, her voice rising so the neighbors and the cameras could hear. "Agent Sterling didn't move here by accident. He moved here to document the systematic patterns of bias in the Brookhaven Police Department. For 18 months, he has been the invisible witness to your department's failures." The realization rippled through the crowd. The intruder they had feared was actually a federal watchdog who had been living among them, recording every sideways glance, every unprovoked stop, and every act of discrimination. "You set this up," Miller whispered, his confidence completely shattered. "I bought a home and stood in my own driveway, Miller," Sterling replied, looking him in the eye. "Everything that happened after I stepped out of my car this morning, that was all you. You were given every opportunity to be a professional. You chose to be a predator." Jensen gestured to one of her agents, who stepped forward with a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. With a sharp, metallic snap, the handcuffs fell from Sterling's wrists. He rubbed the circulation back into his hands and straightened his jacket, the silver eagle on his lapel now seeming to glow with the weight of the federal government. At that moment, a local police command vehicle screeched to a halt nearby. Chief Morrison stepped out, his face the color of wet cement. He saw the FBI SUVs, he saw Director Jensen, and he saw his officer looking like a broken man. "Director Jensen," Morrison said, his voice shaking. "I can explain." "Save it, Chief," Jensen snapped. "Your department receives $2.3 million in federal funding annually. That funding is now under immediate review for civil rights violations under Section 14,141. Morrison looked like he might faint. The financial lifeblood of his department was being severed in real time, in front of a national audience. Sterling stepped toward Miller, who was now leaning against his own cruiser for support. "Officer Miller, do you remember what I told you to do with your badge number?" Miller couldn't even nod. "Good," Sterling said, "because you're going to have plenty of time to memorize it. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending federal prosecution for deprivation of rights under color of law." As news helicopters began to hum in the distance, Sterling looked at Mrs. Gable and her phone. He knew this was only the beginning. The black tale of Brookhaven was about to become the lead story on every news cycle in America. Chief Morrison thought his badge was a shield. He didn't realize that in the hands of the FBI, it's just a target. 10:15 a.m., the interrogation hasn't even started, and the chief is already sweating through his uniform. The humidity of the morning seemed to thicken, pressing down on Chief Morrison as he stood between the federal agents and his disgraced officer. Director Sarah Jensen didn't move. She stood with the stillness of a predator that had already won. "Director," Morrison began, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm sure there's been a massive misunderstanding. Officer Miller is one of our most proactive units. He was likely just following a tip about a string of burglaries." "Stop," Jensen said. The single word cut through Morrison's excuse like a guillotine. "If you finish that sentence, Chief, I'll add conspiracy to obstruct justice to the list of charges I'm currently compiling. Do not insult my intelligence. And certainly, do not insult Assistant Director Sterling." Elias Sterling stepped forward, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. He looked at Morrison, a man he had seen at local charity galas, a man who had shaken his hand while secretly harboring a department that hunted men who looked like him. "Chief," Sterling said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone. "For 18 months I've sat in my study, that window right there, and watched your proactive units. I've seen them stop every delivery driver of color. I've seen them follow my wife, Kesha, to the grocery store. I've seen them pull over teenage boys for the crime of driving a car their fathers worked 30 years to buy." Sterling pulled a small, encrypted tablet from the inside of his jacket. He tapped the screen, and a map of Brookhaven appeared, glowing with hundreds of red dots. "Each dot, Chief, is a recorded incident," Sterling continued. "Time-stamped, GPS verified, video recorded from hidden bureau-grade 4K optics installed in my landscaping. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a data-driven map of systemic racism." Morrison's eyes bulged as he looked at the screen. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering. It wasn't just Miller. It was the entire culture of the Brookhaven PD. "I had no idea it was this extensive," Morrison whispered, a pathetic attempt to distance himself from the fire. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Director Jensen stepped back into the conversation, her heels clicking on the pavement with rhythmic finality. "As the chief, you are responsible for the spirit of your force. If you didn't know, you're incompetent. If you did know, you're a criminal. Either way, your tenure ends today." Across the street, the crowd was growing. Mrs. Gable's live stream had been picked up by a local news affiliate. A news chopper was now hovering overhead, the heavy thrum-thrum-thrum of its blades adding a pulse of urgency to the scene. Officer Sarah Vance, sensing the ship was sinking, stepped toward Sterling. "Sir, Assistant Director Sterling, I was just following Officer Miller's lead. I didn't." Sterling turned his gaze to her. It wasn't angry, it was disappointed. "Officer Vance, the just following orders defense died in 1945. You had a choice to speak up when Miller shoved me. You had a choice to verify my ID when I told you who I was. You chose the path of least resistance. And in the eyes of the FBI, that makes you an accomplice." Jensen signaled to her agents. "Secure the local cruisers. I want the dashcam footage from Miller's car and Vance's car. Now, if so much as a frame is missing, I'll have the entire IT department of Brookhaven PD in orange jumpsuits by sunset." The FBI agents moved with cold efficiency. They didn't ask for keys, they took them. They didn't ask for permission, they took the scene. Morrison watched as his power evaporated in the span of 10 minutes. He looked at Miller, who was now sitting on the curb, his head in his hands, his badge lying in the dirt where it had fallen during the scuffle. "What happens now?" Morrison asked, his shoulders slumped. "Now," Sterling said, stepping closer to the chief, "we go to your precinct. We lock the doors, we seize the servers, and we begin the architect of accountability protocol. Every arrest made by this department in the last 5 years will be reviewed. Every fine will be scrutinized. Every use of force will be litigated." Sterling paused, looking up at the colonial house he had called home for 2 years, a house that had been a fortress of observation. "You thought I was a trespasser in my own home, Chief," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Morrison could hear. "But the truth is, you're the trespasser. You've been trespassing on the rights of this community for too long, and today I'm serving the eviction notice." Director Jensen checked her watch. 10:30 a.m. "Load them up," she commanded. As the agents began to escort Miller and Vance toward the black SUVs, the neighbors, the same neighbors who had looked at Sterling with suspicion, began to clap. It started with 1, then 10, then the whole street. They weren't clapping for the police. They were clapping for the man who had finally brought the truth into the light. But Sterling didn't wave. He didn't smile. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. The legal battle to dismantle a corrupt system would take more than one morning in the sun. It would take a war. "Director," Sterling said, turning to Jensen, "let's get to the station. I want to be the one to turn off the lights." 11:02 a.m. The Brookhaven Police Department didn't just lose its authority, it lost its keys. The FBI isn't here to ask questions. They're here to take the hard drives. The fortress is falling. The convoy of black SUVs pulled into the restricted parking lot of the Brookhaven precinct with a synchronized roar. They didn't park in the visitor spots. They blocked the exits. They blocked the patrol bays. Director Sarah Jensen was the first one out. She didn't wait for an escort. Beside her, Elias Sterling adjusted his cufflinks, his presence radiating a quiet power that made the desk sergeant inside go pale behind the bulletproof glass. "Open the door," Jensen commanded, her voice amplified by the quiet of the lobby. The sergeant stammered, his hand hovering over the buzzer. "I need to clear this with the captain." "The captain is currently being detained on Heritage Drive," Sterling interrupted, leaning into the intercom. "And if you don't buzz this door in the next 3 seconds, my agents will remove it from the hinges. 1, 2. The magnetic lock clicked open. A dozen FBI agents flooded the lobby like a tidal wave. They didn't move with chaos. They moved with the clinical precision of a surgical team. Each agent knew exactly which desk, which server, and which filing cabinet was theirs to seize. "What is the meaning of this?" Lieutenant Miller, no relation to Grant, but possessing the same arrogant swagger, emerged from the back offices. He stopped dead when he saw the FBI windbreakers and the cold, unyielding eyes of Sarah Jensen. "Federal seizure under the Civil Rights Act," Jensen said, sliding a thick stack of warrants across the high front desk. "We are taking control of all digital and physical records dating back 5 years. Your servers are now the property of the United States government. Your evidence locker is under federal seal. And your officers, they are to report to the briefing room for individual interviews. Now." Lieutenant Miller looked at the warrant, then at Sterling. "Sterling, I know you. You're the guy who bought the house on the hill. We thought you were a consultant or something." "I am a consultant," Sterling said, a thin, sharp smile touching his lips. "I consult on the best ways to remove rot from a structure, and Lieutenant, your floor is infested." The precinct, usually a hub of loud bravado and the clatter of handcuffs, fell into a stunned silence. Officers stood by their desks, hands raised or hovering near their belts, unsure of how to react to a power greater than their own. Sterling walked through the bullpen, his eyes scanning the walls. He saw the Wall of Fame, photos of big busts and smiling officers. He saw Officer Grant Miller's desk, decorated with a thin blue-lined flag and a coffee mug that said, "I am the law." Sterling picked up the mug, looked at it for a second, and then let it drop. It shattered against the linoleum floor. "Collect the hard drives from the Internal Affairs office first," Sterling ordered 2 agents. "I want the deleted files recovered, specifically the ones labeled Oak Ridge complaints from last July." "You won't find anything," the lieutenant sneered, though his forehead was beginning to bead with sweat. "We run a clean ship here." "A ship looks clean when you throw the trash overboard before anyone sees it," Sterling countered. "But we've been fishing, Lieutenant. We have the dashcam audio from the cruiser that lost its footage during the Taylor arrest last year. We have the cloud backups you forgot to scrub." The tension in the room was a physical weight. One young officer, a rookie named Marcus Thorne, looked at Sterling with a mixture of fear and something else, hope. Sterling noticed. He paused by the young man's desk. "Officer Thorne," Sterling said quietly, "you've been on the force 6 months. You filed 3 anonymous memos about procedural irregularities in your squad. All 3 were ignored by your superiors." Thorne's eyes widened. "How did you?" "I'm the FBI, son. It's my job to know who the good ones are," Sterling whispered. "Go to the break room. You're the only one in this room who doesn't need an attorney today." As Thorne walked away, the true scale of the Operation Mirror revelation began to sink in for the rest of the department. This wasn't just about one bad stop in a driveway. This was about the digital trail of 1,000 small injustices. Director Jensen walked into the chief's office and sat behind his desk. She didn't ask. She simply took the seat of power. She looked at the computer screen, which was already being mirrored onto a federal laptop by a technician. "Elias," she called out. Sterling stepped into the office. "Look at the special interest folder," Jensen said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. Sterling looked. It wasn't just names of suspects. It was a list of every high-income resident of color in the county. Their car models, their work schedules, their children's schools. It was a surveillance log of the people they were supposed to protect. "They weren't just policing," Sterling said, his voice trembling with a rare flash of visible anger. "They were hunting." "And the hunt ends today," Jensen replied. Outside, the news helicopters were circling closer. The crowd outside the precinct was growing. The people of Brookhaven were beginning to realize that the sirens they heard weren't for a crime in the streets. They were for the crimes being uncovered inside the station. Sterling turned back to the bullpen, looking at the officers who were now being escorted into the briefing room one by one. "The architect of accountability is here," Sterling announced to the room, his voice booming like a final judgment. "And the blueprints for your new lives are being written in these files. Every secret you thought was buried is about to be the lead story on the evening news." He looked at the clock. 11:45 a.m. 1 hour, Sterling muttered to himself. 1 hour to destroy a decades-old system of oppression. Not a bad morning's work. But he knew the real beast was still hidden. The black tail went deeper than the precinct. It went to the city hall. It went to the courts. And Elias Sterling was just getting warmed up. 1:14 p.m. behind the sirens and the handcuffs lies a paper trail made of greed. Officer Miller wasn't just patrolling. He was harvesting for a system that fed on the poor to line the pockets of the powerful. The audit has begun, and the numbers don't lie. The air in the records room was stale, untouched by the frantic energy of the takeover upstairs. Elias Sterling pulled a heavy, leather-bound folder from the bottom shelf of a locked cabinet. While the rest of the FBI team was focused on digital servers, Sterling knew the old guard of Brookhaven still kept their most dangerous secrets on paper. Beside him, Director Sarah Jensen illuminated the workspace with a high-powered tactical flashlight. "What are we looking at, Elias?" "The green ledger, Sarah," Sterling replied, his voice a low hum in the cramped space. "In my 18 months of undercover work, I heard whispers of it. The officers didn't call it policing. They called it the harvest." He flipped open the cover. Inside were neat columns of names, dates, and dollar amounts. It wasn't a record of crimes, it was a record of revenue. "Look at the zip codes," Sterling pointed out, his finger tracing the ink. 90% of the heavy fines, the broken taillight citations, the loitering charges, the resisting fees, they all come from the 3 lowest income blocks on the edge of the county. But look where the money goes. Jensen leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "The Judicial Discretionary Fund. That's not a city account." "No," Sterling said, his eyes cold. "It's a private trust, managed by Judge Silas Thorne, the same judge who signs every warrant for this department. It's a closed loop, Sarah. The police manufacture the arrests, the judge ensures the maximum fines are paid, and the profit is split between the precinct's bonus pool and the judge's campaign fund." The scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. It wasn't just a few bad apples like Grant Miller. It was a factory of injustice designed to extract wealth from the marginalized. Sterling pulled out his phone and took high-resolution photos of every page. "This is why they targeted me this morning. They weren't just being biased, they were being protective. They saw a man in a $3 million house who looked like the people they've been fleecing for years. They were terrified that someone with my resources would start asking the very questions we're answering right now." Suddenly, the door to the archives swung open. Chief Morrison stood there, flanked by 2 of his personal internal affairs officers. He didn't look like a defeated man anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. "You're overstepping, Sterling," Morrison spat, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Those are confidential personnel files. The FBI has no jurisdiction over municipal judicial records without a specific warrant." Sterling didn't even look up from the ledger. "Director Jensen is holding that warrant right now, Chief. And as for jurisdiction, when you use federal highways and federal grants to facilitate a racketeering scheme, you become my business. You think you can just walk into my town and tear it down?" Morrison stepped closer, the tension in the room spiking to a breaking point. "I've been the law here for 30 years. I've seen men like you come and go. You'll be back in D.C. in a week, and I'll still be here." Sterling finally looked up. He didn't look angry, he looked predatory. He stood slowly, his height dwarfing the chief in the narrow aisle. "You're right about one thing, Morrison," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "I will be back in D.C., but when I go, I'm taking a very large box with me. It'll have your name on it, along with Judge Thorne, and every officer who took a bonus from this blood-stained ledger." "You have no proof," Morrison growled. "I have 18 months of my own life," Sterling countered. "I have the testimony of Officer Marcus Thorne, who finally broke silence 10 minutes ago, and I have this." Sterling held up a small, silver microSD card. "This is the audio from the golf club locker room last month. You remember that conversation about clearing the streets before the new development project started? You were quite vocal about which demographics needed to be discouraged from staying." Morrison's face went from red to a sickly, ashen gray. The silence in the archives was absolute. The chief's hand dropped away from his weapon. He knew the game was over. Sarah, Sterling said, handing the ledger to Director Jensen. Call the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tell them we don't just have a civil rights case. We have a RICO case. We're not just firing police officers today. We're dismantling a criminal enterprise. As the FBI agents escorted a silent, broken Chief Morrison out of the room, Sterling stayed behind for a moment. He touched the spine of the ledger, thinking of all the families whose lives had been disrupted for the sake of these columns of numbers. He thought of his father, who had told him that the law was either a shield or a sword. For 30 years in Brookhaven, it had been a sword. Time to sharpen the shield, Sterling whispered. He checked his watch. 2:00 p.m. The sun was beginning its descent, but the light being shed on Brookhaven was only getting brighter. Part 7, Sterling muttered to himself as he walked toward the elevator. The courtroom of public opinion. Let's see how the judge likes being the one in the hot seat. 2:30 p.m. Judge Thorne is about to sentence another innocent man to a fine he can't afford. He doesn't see the man in the charcoal suit standing at the back of the room. The architect is here, and the court is no longer in session. The air in the courtroom was thick with the smell of old wood and the quiet desperation of those waiting for their fates to be decided. Judge Silas Thorne sat atop his high bench, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. To the public, he was a pillar of the community. To the Green Ledger, he was a shareholder in a human trafficking scheme disguised as law and order. Next case, Thorne barked, his voice bored and dismissive. A young man, no older than 20, stood trembling before him. His crime? An obstructed view due to a hanging air freshener, which had escalated into a resisting charge when he asked why he was being pulled over. Guilty, Thorne muttered, not even looking at the paperwork. $500 fine or 10 days in county. Step down. Your Honor, please, the boy's mother cried from the front row. He was just going to work. Quiet in my court. Thorne slammed his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I'm afraid I have to disagree, Silas. The voice came from the back of the room. It wasn't loud, but it held a frequency of power that made every head turn. Elias Sterling walked down the center aisle. He wasn't running, he was marching. Behind him, 4 FBI agents in suits followed in a diamond formation, their faces expressionless. Thorne squinted, his face tightening. Who is this? Bailiff, remove this man. The bailiff stepped forward, reaching for his belt, but he stopped when the lead FBI agent flashed a gold shield. Stay where you are, officer, the agent commanded. Sterling reached the front of the room and stood at the defense table. He looked up at Thorne, his eyes like 2 pieces of polished flint. My name is Elias Sterling, Assistant Director of the FBI, and this court is now a federal crime scene. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The news crews that had followed the convoy from the precinct began to spill into the back of the room, cameras flashing. You have no standing here, Sterling, Thorne roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. This is a municipal court. I am the presiding judge. You were the presiding judge, Sterling corrected, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady. As of 2:15 p.m., the Third Circuit Court of Appeals has issued an emergency stay on all your current proceedings, and I have a federal warrant for your arrest, Silas. Racketeering, extortion, and the deprivation of rights under color of law. Sterling reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photos, the pages of the Green Ledger. He tossed them onto the court reporter's desk. Do these numbers look familiar? The Judicial Discretionary Fund? We've already tracked the wire transfers from the Brookhaven PD's bonus pool directly into your offshore account in the Caymans. It turns out, your campaign wasn't funded by the people. It was funded by the fines you squeezed out of them. Thorne gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. That's a fabrication, a political hit job. We have the recordings, Silas, Sterling said, stepping closer until he was standing directly beneath the judge's bench. We have Chief Morrison in a recorded interview as we speak. He's already trading your name for a shorter sentence. He told us about the meeting last May, the one where you told him to increase the harvest to pay for your new summer home. The courtroom was silent. The young man who had just been sentenced looked at Sterling with tears in his eyes. The mother in the front row began to sob, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, overwhelming weight of justice finally arriving. You're a trespasser, Silas, Sterling said, throwing the judge's own words back at him. You've been trespassing on the lives of these people for 30 years. You've used that gavel like a club to beat the poor and the marginalized into submission. Sterling turned to the gallery, speaking to the cameras. Today, the architect of accountability doesn't just look at the police. We look at the bench. Because a corrupt cop is a tragedy, but a corrupt judge is a catastrophe. Director Jensen stepped into the room, holding a pair of handcuffs. She didn't hand them to a bailiff. She walked up the steps to the bench herself. Silas Thorne, Jensen said, her voice echoing. Please stand. The judge, the man who had held the power of life and death over the county, looked down at the steel in her hands. He looked at Sterling, who stood like a statue of vengeance in a charcoal suit. Thorne stood. His legs shook. As the handcuffs clicked shut over his wrists, the sound was picked up by every microphone in the room. It was the sound of a system breaking. Part 8 is coming, Silas, Sterling whispered as the judge was led away in front of the world. The final audit. We're going to find every person you've wronged, and we're going to make them whole. Sterling turned back to the young man at the defense table. Your record is cleared, son. Go home to your mother. The room erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar of liberation. But Sterling didn't stay to celebrate. He had one more stop. He had to go back to the house on the hill. He had to finish the story where it started. The cuffs are on the judge. The chief's badge is in an evidence bag. But the real work starts when the cameras turn off. 6:00 p.m. The architect isn't just building a case, he's building a future. Because in this neighborhood, justice isn't a visitor anymore. It lives here. Elias Sterling straightened his tie in the reflection of his car window. His wife, Kesha, stepped out onto the porch of their colonial home. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look of relief and pride in her eyes was the only validation he needed. For 18 months, they had lived as ghosts in this community, watching, waiting, and enduring the sidelong glances of neighbors who wondered if they truly belonged. Today, the world knew they belonged. Is it over? Kesha asked, her voice soft but steady. The siege is over, Elias replied, walking up the steps to meet her. But the restoration is just beginning. We have 5 years of cases to overturn. We have families to find. We have a department to rebuild from the ground up. Behind them, the neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights felt different. Doors that had been locked were opening. Mrs. Gable, the woman whose live stream had sparked a national firestorm, walked across the street. She didn't look at Elias with suspicion this time. She looked at him with a profound, humbled respect. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Elias looked at her, his expression softening but remaining grave. Documentation is the first step toward justice, Mrs. Gable. Your phone did what 30 years of complaints couldn't. You didn't just record a video, you recorded a confession. Thank you. By nightfall, the news of the Brookhaven purge had reached the highest levels of the Department of Justice. Elias sat in his home office, the same room where he had meticulously logged every civil rights violation for over a year. On his screen, A new generation of federal agents, men and women of all backgrounds, awaited his briefing. They saw him not just as a superior, but as proof. Proof that the system could be turned inward to heal itself. Proof that quiet leadership, backed by strategic patience and cold, hard evidence, was more powerful than any riot or any rhetoric. "Remember today," Elias told the young agents via the secure link. "When you put on that badge, you aren't just carrying a piece of metal. You're carrying the trust of every person who has ever been pushed against a car hood for no reason. You are the architects. Build something that won't fall." He thought of his father, a man who had survived the segregated South with nothing but his dignity and a belief that the law, though flawed, was a tool that could be mastered. Elias had mastered it. He hadn't just survived the trap set by Officer Miller. He had used the trap to dismantle the entire forest. As the moon rose over the quiet suburb, Elias walked back to the edge of his driveway. He looked down at his watch. The same silver Omega Miller had tried to claim was stolen. It was 9:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours since the encounter began. In 12 hours, a corrupt police force had been decapitated, a predatory judge had been dethroned, and a community had been forced to look into a mirror and see the ugliness it had allowed to fester. Elias Sterling wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was the standard. And as he turned to walk back into his home, he knew that the black tale of Brookhaven wouldn't end in tragedy. It would end in transformation. "Your story matters," Sterling says, his voice a deep, commanding resonance that vibrates in the chest of the viewer. "Every injustice you witness, every bias you document, every moment you choose courage over comfort, it all adds up. I stood in this driveway for 18 months so that one day you won't have to." He leans forward, the intensity in his eyes burning through the screen. "Don't just watch this. Be the evidence. If you have witnessed bias, if you have felt the sting of a system that wasn't built for you, share your experience in the comments below. Your black tale could be the missing piece of a larger puzzle of justice." Subscribe to this channel to join a movement of quiet courage and systemic change. We don't just tell stories here. We document the truth until the truth cannot be ignored. Visit our website for Know Your Rights training and resources on how to safely report federal civil rights violations. Together, we are the architects. Together, we build the accountability. And remember, when you see injustice, don't just get angry, get evidence.